Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here with us. We've got a great turnout for this show. My name's Marcus Grimm. I'm a marketing strategist here at Ascendle. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, How to Ship in 3 months instead of 3 years. I'm joined today by Susanna Parnan-Mitchell and Dave Todaro, both of Ascendle. Now, before we begin the presentation, I do want to remind you that we will be running a live Q&A toward the end of the webinar. We have enabled the Q&A feature. It's located in those Zoom controls on your screen. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation. And you can also click on the like button if you want to upvote some of your favorite questions that you see there. We encourage you to do that. Now, if you miss anything in today's presentation, don't worry. We'll email you a link to this recording along with all of the slides as well. Hey, let's get started with the introductions. We've got a great group of panelists today. Our first panelist is Susanna Parnan-Mitchell. She's a project lead here at Ascendle. Here she helps clients plan, manage, and deliver complex software builds via those proven agile processes. For 3 years, she's been embedded within the product strategy department of one of Ascendle's clients, where she has helped with product definition, process creation, and various strategic initiatives, including feature prioritization. And that's great because it's the topic of today's webinar. Our second panelist probably needs no introduction. It's Dave Todaro, founder and CEO of Ascendle. For the last 35 years, Dave has been a technology leader. He's been involved in all aspects of product vision, software engineering, and entrepreneurship. Now, let me just take just a moment to introduce you to Ascendle. For those of you who don't know, Ascendle is a leader in custom software development. We partner with companies as their full service development team to create mobile and web applications to drive their business goals. We offer web, app, and platform development along with product strategy and product design as well. Here's all those logos, just a few of our clients. As you can see, we work with a wide variety of businesses and organizations, from those early stage startups right all the way up to some of the largest companies in the world. And of course, we wrote the book. Dave spent 2 years to capture everything we know about agile development, and in 2019 published the 500-page Epic Guide to Agile. It's a fantastic read. Let's take a look at some of the topics we'll be addressing in today's panel discussion. First, we'll be taking a look at why a prioritization framework even makes sense to deploy. We'll also review some of those inherent biases that behavioral scientists warn us they frequently see, that those types of things can directly influence what gets onto that backlog and what moves to the top of the backlog as well. Though there are many popular feature prioritization frameworks, today you're going to find us focusing on 3 distinct models. And finally, we'll ask our panelists for some ways to think about which framework might work best for your particular organization. And of course, we'll be sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of today's program. Now, before we dive into different feature prioritization models, we do want to spend a few minutes discussing why a framework, well, any framework for that matter, might make sense. I'd like to welcome our 2 panelists to turn on their cameras. Dave, let's begin with you. You've been involved with software projects, and as we all know, each one of them has their own list of potential features. So in your experience, why does a framework make sense for feature prioritization?
Yeah, well, first, let me just talk about why prioritize. It may seem pretty obvious, but there's really 2 problems that we see when we build new software. One is sort of back in the waterfall days where we get this 400-page specification and all of it is the number 1 priority. So we need to design everything to do with all of the various layers of the system to handle all of the features. And we know how that story goes, right? Yep, it should be, about a year to do this. 3 years later, you're still trying to get the product done. So we certainly don't want to do that. But even with an agile approach, you can still run into problems. So if you don't ruthlessly prioritize, like we like to say, then we might work on some of the lesser important features first, because again, we have that schedule projection. We know it's going to take this amount of time. But the dirty little secret with software, those of us who have been in the business for a while, is it's really hard to predict, especially at the very beginning of a project where you don't have a team that's up and running and cranking away at this new software application. So the problem is that, well, we think it's going to take this long. Let's just say it's 6 months. And then we get to the month 5 and we realize we have another 18 months left. the business leaders will look at that and say, well, wait a minute, what about all the time you spent on that stuff that if I knew I wasn't going to get everything, I would have not had you spend time on that stuff. So what we really want to be careful about is always answering kind of this question. If I could only have one thing, or if I could only have one feature, what would it be? And have the team work on that first, because that way you have that sort of in the bag, it's good to go. And then you can work on the next feature and the next feature and the next feature. So our somewhat provocative title, How to Ship in 3 months instead of 3 years, it really is just like that. Now, you might not decide to ship in just 3 months. You might decide to build some more things. But the important thing is that if you, in fact, spend the first 3 months building the most important features, then you give a lot of power to the business. The business can then say, you know what? Well, let me show this to some prospective customers. We may think that we need to spend another 6 months building stuff, but you show it to them and they say, you know what? I could use that right now. I want that. And in fact, we've had that experience with one of our clients. They thought that they were going to have about an 8-month timeline. They started showing it to some of their customers after about 3 months, and the customers wanted it, and we deployed. So we, in fact, shipped 3 months early. When's the last time you heard that talked about with a software project?
Yeah, not very often. That's great insight, Dave. Thanks. Now, Susanna, you've spent much of your career supporting clients that have multiple teams, which means even more features, more stakeholders, multiple products even. What are some of the complexities faced by the enterprise organizations as they seek to prioritize features?
Sure. As you can imagine, there are several ways to crack this nut. In a scenario of a strong product owner and or less than 3 or 2 teams and or well-aligned business stakeholders, a simple approach like Dave was talking about works really well. But of course, not all businesses fit into that model, especially large, more complex enterprises, like you're saying, where there might be multiple products or product lines. In these scenarios, prioritization frameworks, analytical ones, are helpful because they reliably and consistently take in and normalize the inputs, whether that's product vision, direct customer requests, needs for operational efficiency or security within the product or the organization. In general, I think a more robust framework helps it the most when there are multiple competing opinions in the room or within the organization for what is most important.
That is very, very well said. And I think if you're on the call today, whether you have multiple teams, large teams, or small teams, the goal of today's program is that we actually have several options for you as well. So as we move forward, whether your team is large or small, let's face it, they're all made up of human beings. And the fact of the matter is that without an analytical framework to prioritize, your conclusions will likely be clouded by that word we all talk about, and that word is bias. Now, the Wikipedia page for biases lists as many as 175 different biases that humans are susceptible to. Not only that, but it's important to realize what a bias is and why they develop. See, most of the biases that we bring to the table, well, they actually come from a good place. It's our brain's way to save time or energy. But when you allow your brain to ignore or gloss over data, well, we're liable to make some conclusions that can be factually incorrect. So we're going to take a look at just a few common biases. Ask yourself if you've seen these inside your organization. So the first one I want to talk about is sample size bias. Are you getting feedback from enough people? And of course, are they the right people? Now, oftentimes quantitative research, it's hard to come by. And so those very small sample sizes, well, they can influence what we work on next. Ask yourself this question: how many times has a feature request made it onto your backlog because a salesperson talked to just 1 or 2 clients? And oftentimes that sample size bias, well, it goes hand in hand with what we call confirmation bias. So as soon as you get one customer that confirms what the sales department was thinking, well, it shows up on the backlog and maybe a little bit higher than it really should. Or maybe you're familiar with recency bias. That feature that you just thought about, well, that's the one that sometimes gets weighed a little too heavily. So recency bias causes you to give more weight to those recent events or ideas. So here's another great exercise. Take a look at your backlog sheet for your potential features. Now in Agile, we know that the most important feature should be at the top of the backlog. We'll cross-reference that with the date that the story was added to the backlog. And if you find that the top of your backlog is mostly populated by those newer stories, well, you might be looking at a case of recency bias. And finally, few of us work in truly egalitarian organizations. Most of us have bosses, and in most companies, what the boss says, well, it goes. And to be clear, authority bias can be anything, not just a boss, but it could be an industry expert. See, the authority bias is just your brain's way of saying, well, maybe we don't have to do any analysis. After all, the person who wants this probably knows more than me, right? So there's a lot of biases at play here. Now, as we begin to dive into these frameworks, here's something we want you to keep in mind. Any framework is better than none at all. We're going to be looking at different approaches, and when you see them in action, begin to think about how the nuances of each could be applied at your company. Now, obviously, theory is fun, but truth is nobody has ever hired Ascendle because we're great philosophers. Rather, we get hired for results. So we do want to offer up a real-life hypothetical product that I'm hoping Dave and Susanna can help me out with. Some of you may be familiar with the product called Latch. Latch is a company that has an app, and that app speaks to a door lock. Building owners add users to the system through a browser, and those people hold their phone up to a secure door and are granted entry. Now, even though I'm not actually the product owner of Latch, for today's conversation, I'm going to pretend I am. And we've brainstormed some potential features to add to Latch, and Dave and Susanna are going to help us to prioritize them, utilizing 3 different frameworks. Now, on your screen, you're going to see we've got 4 features that could make this app a little bit better. Even though these features, again, are all hypothetical, I'm going to take a moment and explain them to you. Perhaps you might even have an opinion as to which is best. So first up, I'd like the ability to disable Latch at certain times so people can come and go without using the app. Maybe you have a rental unit and you know that the cleaning company always comes in at a certain time. Next up, how about custom notifications? Well, this could be useful to know. Again, suppose I have a rental unit and I want to know when people have checked into or checked out of my rental. I don't want to look into my browser to know when that happens. I'd prefer custom notifications. My third hypothetical feature that I'd like to add to Latch is, well, these days, if you have data, it probably makes sense to have reporting too. Understanding typical check-in times or typical checkout times, that could help us refine our policies over time. And finally, as a periodic safeguard, it would be great if I could sync my notifications with my booking information so that I can be certain that people are or are not in the unit when it's been booked. So those are my 4 potential features that I could add to Latch, and I'm going to ask Dave and Susanna to help me prioritize them. So at this point, I'm going to bring Dave back into the conversation. As this is the first model we'll be considering today, we decided to start relatively basic. So Dave, at the highest level, what's the simplest way for me to be able to prioritize?
So I kind of alluded to that when I was giving my overview, and it's the if you could only have one thing. And that's a really kind of hand wavy way to explain it. It does make some assumptions. So it makes the assumption that the product owner, who's typically in charge of the backlog, the one person who can decide in what order are we going to build these things. And that's really important, by the way. The product owner is the only person in the company that usually has visibility into both the stakeholders outside the team. What is everybody asking for, from customers to sales to tech support and implementation and training? And they also have visibility into the team itself. What is the team working on? What makes the most sense maybe to work on next? And maybe there's some adjustments to be made to the priorities. So that product owner, that's why the product owner is the only one in the organization that can make the final decision about what this order is. Now, a lot of times we work with clients that have spent a lot of time thinking about this new product that they want to build, or maybe the next generation of an existing product. And they usually have a pretty good gut feel. We can kind of walk them through a couple of things, and we can ask them, all right, what is the first thing that you want? And oftentimes they'll kind of think logically about the product and say, well, the first thing I'll do is log in. And we have a kind of a funny rule here at Ascendle. We never build login first. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, you spend a very small percentage of your time in the login process. And 2, it's a solved problem. And so I'm talking more about the beginning of a product, which might apply to a new product for an established company, a new product for a startup, a new innovation on an existing product or sort of a reimagining of a product, never build login first. You want to build what the user is going to live with and be using all day, every day. So getting to this particular example, I, as the fictitious advisor to the product owner here, Marcus, hey, we've talked to everyone involved, a bunch of customers, and custom notifications, that's really coming up time and time again. That's what I think we should do. If I could only have one thing from the team, that's what it would be. So that's sort of the gut feel approach.
Well, I think that's well said. And as you point out, Dave, you're getting this information from the product owner who theoretically should be getting perspectives from a lot of places. So I think Dave's advice serves you well, of course, assuming you're running a single development team or your feature set is relatively small. Now, that's not the case for many of us, though. Susanna, you're going to help us segue into some of the more analytical approaches, but let's put some context around this. Your experience is often supporting not just multiple teams, but multiple products as well. So when you see this, if you could only have one thing approach, how does this scale?
Well, in short, it really doesn't. As I alluded to earlier, if you could only have one thing approach is a perfect way of prioritizing a single product backlog. In a nutshell, if the prioritization work is straightforward, and as Dave mentioned, if your product owner is knowledgeable and empowered, then this approach is great. But once you get outside of that scenario and you need to scale, then a more robust analytical framework may help you gather and understand the more complex inputs for prioritization, because it can help ensure that you're comparing apples to apples and avoiding some of those biases that you mentioned. This is especially true when you're measuring value in different ways, be it revenue, risk reduction, customer satisfaction. All of these are important to different parts of the organization, and all likely come with their own particular type of confirmation bias. And the analytical framework helps us look across all of these competing needs.
Oh, that is very well said. Thank you, Susanna. So now as we move along, so whether that feature list is too long, or you've got multiple stakeholders, or you're looking to avoid those biases that Susanna just referred to, a more analytical approach is often called for. Now, today we're going to be looking at two different analytical frameworks. The first is the Kano model. It's named after the Japanese professor Noriaki Kano. The second is WSJF, WSJF, and that stands for weighted shortest job first. Now, you'll note that they've got some similarities to one another, but they also have key points of distinction. So as we talk about these, you might want to pay close attention to those points of distinction to determine which might work for you. So let's talk about the Kano model. This is a fun one. Now, in the Kano model, all features, once analyzed, and we will be talking about how to analyze them, we plot them on a grid. So we're going to spend a moment to go over this grid so that you get an understanding of it. That x-axis on the bottom refers to how well a feature has been implemented. So Dave was referring to login screens. Does the login screen work? Is it intuitive? The y-axis, meanwhile, is a reflection with how satisfied the user is just with the availability of having that feature. Was it a feature that you expected to be there or not? Well, the Kano model suggests that every one of these features can be placed into three distinct buckets. Now, the first feature from Kano is what we call a basic feature. These basic features, well, quite frankly, they're expected by our customers. In fact, as you'll see, the exclusion of a basic feature has the potential to harm your product more than the inclusion of it will actually excite the masses. Now, at the same time, because it is just a basic feature, you'll note that the satisfaction curve definitely plateaus with these basic features. Dave, you love to talk about MVP, the minimum viable product. What are the implications here of how we should approach basic features in software development?
Yeah, it's not only the minimum viable product, we like to talk about the minimum viable feature, because you could say, just like you were talking about, even the login screen, you can make something pretty basic, very fancy, etc., all kinds of bells and whistles. But usually login and at least basic security comes into this basic category. And you'll notice, like Marcus said, if you can do just a simple implementation, usually you get the credit, so to speak, pretty quickly in terms of customer satisfaction. And in fact, as you see this curve kind of go down at the end, it shows that if you spend too much time on it, you're kind of spinning your wheels. So that's a really important consideration with the basic features is if you do this process and you discover those features getting into this bucket, focus on the simplest implementation that could possibly work or the minimum viable feature.
Awesome. The second type of feature that we discuss in the Kano model, well, we call those performance features. Now, performance features provide incremental improvements over existing options. Dave, is it safe to say that many companies live or die through those performance features?
Yeah, I think that's where we are. And as you can see here, this is a little bit more linear, meaning the more of these you have, the more fancy they're implemented, then the more satisfaction you'll get. So this is certainly an area that you may want to spend a little bit more time on. And in many cases, this is where we spend most of our time. But as Marcus will talk about in a minute, what I really like about the Kano model is this third category.
Well, I love the segue. Thank you, sir. So the real key to that Kano model is that third category of features. Now, these are the ones that surprise and delight our customers. They've got the potential to really push you out of that Me Too crowd. Dave, we call these exciter features. What are some of the implications we can see when we look at how those exciter features impact this graph more than the other two, or in a different way than the other two features?
Yeah, these are the icing on the cake features. And you'll see by that curve at the top, the more of these you have and the more robustly implemented they are, the more excited your customers are going to be. And when I was first learning about the Kano model, I remember they used the analogy of a hotel room. And today you might go to a hotel room and you have a certain expectation. The room's clean, the bed's clean, it has a bathroom, the bathroom's clean. Particularly today, cleanliness is something that's very important. So you have sort of a basic expectation. You probably expect there to be a TV. And one thing that's interesting about these features is that over time, some performance and exciters might turn into basic. So for example, 20 years ago, if you went into a hotel room, if you had some sort of internet access, that might be pretty exciting because not many hotel rooms would have internet access. And you had to bring your own cable and plug it into the wall. And then an exciter might have been Wi-Fi. Wow, Wi-Fi. Oh my gosh, goodness, I don't have to bring the cable anymore. I can just hook up. Today, those are expected, right? And in fact, if I had to bring a cable to get internet at my hotel room, I'd be thinking, what's with this place? I expect Wi-Fi. So now today, Wi-Fi is a basic feature, whereas before it used to be an exciter. Now, what today would be an exciter, maybe I walk in and I see there's a new PlayStation hooked up to the TV. I can't even get the new PlayStation at home. And here this hotel has one. And if I happen to be a gamer, that's going to be really exciting. It's unexpected. But when I see it, I say, wow, this is pretty amazing. I'm blown away by that. So that's really where things become interesting. Particularly your sales folks will be very interested in those exciters. But what's a slippery slope with the exciters is you don't necessarily know what they are until you start asking your customers about them and start determining that, you know what, I wasn't even thinking about that. But now that you mention it, if I did have that, that would be amazing.
That's a great segue to our next point, which is we've got this pretty fancy graph here. Those of you who are intimidated by math or analysis might be thinking, well, how in the world do I actually plot a Kano graph? You're going to find it's actually a little bit simpler than you thought. Susanna, can you please walk us through there's just two questions that make up the Kano model. Walk us through it, please.
Sure. The idea behind Kano is that you ask your customers two simple questions. One, how they feel if they have the feature, and two, how they feel if they don't have the feature, as Dave was just mentioning. This helps understand their satisfaction levels around each of those types of features. You might expect less excitement around the basic features, but customers would be more likely to be dissatisfied if they didn't have them. So again, asking both questions ensures you're getting valuable information across the board. And I'm sorry, Marcus.
Oh,
and assuming you ask a valid sample size and that you ask these questions consistently, you can get pretty good data telling you where your customers stand with the features that you're evaluating.
Susanna, even before we start plotting this information, though, I feel like there are some obvious ahas that I might get just on an individual feature. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So, for example, if somebody tells you they expect a product to have a given feature, they would dislike it if they didn't. It's probably going to be a feature that we really need to include here.
Outstanding. So it starts really simple. It's two questions. What if the product had the feature? What if the product didn't have the feature? And then we get those 5 different answers. And now what do we actually do with that information? Well, this is where we get into how we actually plot this information. So we've got those 2 critical questions. And with that proper survey data, we have the answers. Dave, what in the world do I do with the data?
Yeah, so this is essentially how those questionnaire answers get mapped into different categories. And you can see that we start with basic performance and excitement, and then there are a few additional categories. Indifferent, it doesn't appear like anyone really cares about this. Reverse, which is this doesn't seem like it's really important data here. In fact, this might be something that we want to omit. And then questionable, which is this isn't really a valid result. So over here on the right, what we see is how you map all of the answers, both with the what they call the functional question. What if the product had this feature? How would you feel? And we're dealing with feelings here, right? How would you feel emotionally if you had this? And then the dysfunctional question, how would you feel if you didn't have it? And so we can map each of the features, and based on the answers, we can map it to this. And it's actually pretty simple. I've done this process just using SurveyMonkey and having it map all of these, and you translate it into this matrix here. We're not going to go through all the ministrations of exactly how you do this, but we do want to show you how the theory works. So if I turn on my pen here for a minute, you can see up here, these are the exciters. So if I I like it if it had that, and if it didn't have that, I expect it to be that way, or neutral, or live with it. So that just kind of gives you an indication of how they feel about that, and that puts it into the exciter. And then we have the basic over here. As Susanna implied, if the customer is not going to be happy if we exclude it, that means that we got to get that in there. That's sort of on the check mark category. And then finally, we have the performance, which is right over here. The more that we do that, the more excited the customers are going to be. So we just wanted to show you how this works so we can give you some actionable information if you want to try it on for size with your feature list.
I like the pen, Dave. That reminds me of watching football. Susanna, this is the first time that we're really talking about bringing data into our analysis. And of course, we're talking about data. So then we're talking about surveys. So one of the questions we always get is advice on, well, how much data do I need? Do you have any advice in terms of how much data you'd like to have in order to have faith in these results? It's an analytical approach, but earlier we talked about sample size bias. So how do we avoid that?
Sure. It's not a one size fits all here. I think it's important to note that it's more based on the level of precision that you need, and also the size of your user base. You could even start to see trends in as few as 10 or maybe less polled customers. But I believe it's best practice for a product with an established user base. There's a range, and that range is between about 30 and 300 participants. Again, dependent on the needed precision and the number of users that you actually have. So it's important to note we're not talking about thousands and thousands here.
Right. And I think one of the other things is obviously how many features that you're trying to compare at the same time as well will tell you how much data that you actually need. So assuming we follow Susanna's advice, we've gotten enough data and we've plotted it accordingly, we would actually plot our results. And with our hypothetical feature list today, you can see the 4 features with our hypothetical results. So we've got the 4 features: disable to schedule or custom notifications, report functionality, and booking sync. Dave, when you look at our results that we plotted here, what jumps out at you?
Well, first of all, the data looks pretty good. We've got some good clusters here. And then the other thing that jumps out is that we've got some pretty clear um, distinction in terms of these different features. They have very nicely aligned up with some of these different categories. And this really gives us something to think about, right? So for example, when I said, well, if I could only have one thing, it was the custom notifications. And I can see that that's a performance feature. But now I see these results, and I realize that both disable scheduler and report functionality are basic, which means that if I don't do these, my customers, I have the risk of at least some of my customers to be unhappy. So that might kind of make me scratch my head and say, you know what, guys, maybe we should focus in on these reports and disabling the scheduler. And then we can kind of think about, maybe we want to do this exciter, which might tie into the timing of what we're doing. We're maybe going to a trade show, and we know we're going to be up against some competitors. And this particular exciter, the booking sync, is something we know those competitors don't have, and we want some of that, icing on the cake or cherry on top to drive a wedge between us. And those are sort of the choices. If I show up without custom notifications to that trade show, and if my customers have to wait for it a little bit, then we're okay with that.
Well said. It's good to see us using analysis here, but Susanna, at the same time as I look at these results, this approach does bring up a few questions. So what's something that's missing here?
Sure. As Dave was saying, we can see what those exciter features are, but by the same token, we know that the lack of basic features is a problem. So the question is, do we do those basic features first and hope the market will wait? I think there's good information here, but there's not a clear point to say which we should do first, what the priority should be. I think it's in this way that kind of does a great job of segmentation and understanding customer preference, but by itself, it doesn't offer that prioritization that we're looking for.
It's a great point. Anything else that you'd add there?
Sure. Again, it's great for understanding what your customer wants and what will satisfy them, but it doesn't factor in the other pieces that I mentioned briefly earlier, such as inputs from the rest of the organization, like organizational risk or timing constraints. So for scenarios where those factors are at play, it doesn't get us all the way there. And I think maybe most importantly is that it doesn't consider the effort that it's going to take to deliver on these features, which might be a big factor in figuring out what you want to do first.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we've been talking all about what customers want and what we want to deliver. We haven't spent any time yet talking about constraints. And the reality is we all have constraints. So while it's good to know what those customers want, we do have to acknowledge the effort that we need to do to bring it to them, which brings us to our next framework, WSJF, or weighted shortest job first. So before we go on to WSJF, though, we are going to have to introduce you to an interesting method of measuring things that, quite frankly, we're going to be measuring some things that are really difficult to measure. Dave, what am I seeing on my screen here, and how in the world does it relate to feature prioritization?
Absolutely. Those of you who are familiar with Scrum and story points might recognize this as what's oftentimes called the Cone scale, after Mike Cohn, one of the pioneers of Agile. And it's a modified Fibonacci sequence for you math buffs. The idea here is that as the scale gets larger, the distance between each of the numbers grows. And what this recognizes is that this is an imprecise science. When humans are doing estimation, we could use a scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but if we're a little bit off, if it really should be a 4 and I kind of set a 5, there's not a lot of discrimination there. So what this says is, instead, if the size estimate or the estimate in general gets bigger, we should probably leave a little bit more wiggle room, because as things grow larger, the penalty is pretty big. If I was using this just to estimate size, and I was using just a scale of 1 through 5, my error, again, between 4 and 5 is going to be a lot different between my as compared to my error between 20 and 40 or 13 and 20. So this scale, the reason we're talking about this is because in a minute we're going to be going through how some of the math works with this WSJF technique. And this scale is going to be applied to a lot of these different metrics that we're going to have, again, our humans, our stakeholders weighing in on.
Yeah, and as Dave mentions, generally speaking, there's more than one stakeholder. So, Susanna, we've talked about the fact that you're often responsible for getting large teams to come to agreement on these numbers. So it's all fine if we all look at a particular task and we say it's worth a 20 or it's going to take us a 20. But Susanna, with those large teams that you work with, what are some tactics that you follow if you've got some stakeholders thinking a given feature is worth 5 and another stakeholder thinks it's worth a 20? How do you rectify that?
Sure. As Dave was alluding to, one of the main benefits of conducting relative estimating exercise is that it gets everybody on the same page. So when there's a gap like that, what you're referring to, it's a flag that there's a problem and that somebody isn't in alignment. Oftentimes, this is because somebody um, has more information than everybody else in the room, or maybe that they don't have as much information as everybody else in the room. So when you see that gap, say more than one sequence jump apart in this scale, then you use it as an opportunity to pause and talk about why that is. It's a conversation. Then what we've done in practice is after all the points have been made, you revote and you simply don't move on. You continue the conversation until you've reached consensus.
It's a great answer. Yeah, getting consensus on these numbers matters a lot because now we're going to start to plug them into our WSJF formula. So knowing what type of scale we'll be using to fill in this formula, we can look at the formula itself. Now, again, WSJF stands for the weightest, shortest job first. Essentially, we are looking for the most important features that can be produced in the shortest period of time. Now, to determine WSJF, you're actually not looking at the WSJF formula quite yet. There's another step involved before we get to it. So to determine this, we first need to quantify something that's referred to as the cost of delay. In other words, what is the risk to not having this feature? Susanna, could you please walk us through the cost of delay formula?
Sure. I think in the simplest of terms, cost of delay means the value that's lost by not doing the work. As you were mentioning, it's not all of the WSJF formula, it is the numerator in the WSJF equation, and it's essentially the weighted part of the model. The underlying premise here is that the more business value is achieved over time if you can prioritize in a way that allows you to reach some return on your investment sooner. So to get to cost of delay, you combine 4 pieces here, or 3. It's user business value, time criticality, and either risk reduction or opportunity enablement. So with user business value, to weigh this, you're going to ask yourself a couple of questions. And this is also kind of where the customer satisfaction piece comes in. You're asking things like, what is the relative value to the customer or the business? Do our users prefer this over that? What's the revenue impact on our business? Those types of things help you reach a value there. The next is time criticality. To evaluate this, you might consider questions like, is there a fixed deadline? Have we committed to a customer? Is our competition going to beat us to market? Will our customers wait for this? Or is the user or business value going to decay over time? Maybe are there milestones that need to be hit by a certain date to achieve the entire project? The last piece is expressed as either risk reduction or opportunity enablement. And so you're choosing one of those. Generally, a feature has one or the other. So you use the one that's most applicable. For risk reduction, you might ask, is there a risk to the business if we don't complete it? Things such as security, competition, et cetera. Those are what comes to mind here. For opportunity enablement, you might think about leverage. Is there leverage that can be gained by doing this feature in other areas of our business? You know, what does this open up in terms of opportunity for the business? Those types of questions.
Dave, if you read about WSJF online, people sometimes get tripped up by this time criticality one. And some of the, because in a little bit here, we're going to be applying scores to this, but some people have mentioned that when you look at time criticality, well, aren't basically, if I hit my deadline, I win. And if I don't hit my deadline, I lose. And so applying a scale to time criticality seems like it could be a little bit confusing. Any advice on how to go about that?
Well, again, this is all based on individual opinion and of the various stakeholders. And some people are going to have different perspectives. And that's part of the power of this. Oftentimes, we use a technique that's applied to estimating in Agile, which is planning poker, where everyone is going to throw a virtual card out on the screen and say, well, okay, you voted a 3 and you voted an 8. Let's talk about this. And so the time criticality, it ties into what some of what Susanna was talking about. So Cindy knows that, well, we promised this to a customer, one of our biggest customers, and no one else in the room actually knows that that promise was made. Maybe it was just made, last week. So, she's going to throw out a higher number, and someone else is going to throw out a lower number, and then the conversation gets going. And then everyone's going to kind of weigh that. And then, like Susanna said, you revote and let's see if everyone's convinced. And then maybe some other people think, you know what, that used to be our most important customer, but we've got all these other prospective customers that are going to be more strategically important. So maybe I don't get up to an 8, but maybe I get up to a 5, and we settle on a 5. And again, that's part of the power here, is that instead of just kind of going off the cuff and spending this very valuable time that we have from the development team, which is a consumable resource, right? The time of the team and the effort of the team is consumable. If I have them working on the wrong thing, that's gone. I can't get it back. So this can be a little contentious sometimes, which is what you want, and you want to kind of flush that out. But that time criticality, oftentimes it's very obvious. There's a trade show and we made a press release that we're going to have this feature. We kind of have to show up with it. Or it is in fact our biggest customer, by far our biggest revenue generator, and they've been asking about this for 2 years, and we did in fact give them a date, and it's 3 months from now, and we have to do it. So again, it may not always be as clear cut, but if you do get the right stakeholders in the room, and again, the right stakeholders are usually across those different areas of the business. Again, someone who is either an actual customer or a representative of the customer, sales and marketing, customer support, implementation, training, all those sort of customer relations, and development as well. That's something that some people miss, is that the development representative might look at that risk reduction and say, you know what, guys, we do actually have to do some refactoring that is going to allow us to do these other things that we've been talking about in the next few quarters. And so I'm going to raise my hand as sort of the technical representative and say, guys, I know what's going on underneath the covers. That's why I'm voting a big number here.
That's very, very well said. Now, before we move on, we're going to plug in some numbers into our cost of delay here. I want to remind everyone, please keep those questions and we'll handle the answers. You handle the questions. Please feel free to put in any questions in the panel. We'll be getting them in just a few minutes as we wrap up this presentation. But hey, I'm still trying to figure out what to do with my Latch product. So let's go ahead and plug in some cost of delay figures. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug in the 2 features that scored the best during Kano analysis. You might remember we were talking about custom notifications and that booking sync feature. So we're dropping in the numbers from the cone scale, where we are assessing both the user business value and the time criticality. So for our 1 feature, we followed Dave's advice. We considered that the competition already had custom notifications. So we're calling that a feature that enables risk reduction. We better do it, or we're going to lag behind the competition. Whereas we think that booking sync, that's going to create new opportunity for us. So you'll notice there's an opportunity enablement score there. So essentially what we see before we finish this formula, just on the cost of delay element of the equation, we can see that booking sync is coming in just a tad higher than custom notifications. So before we get on to the final formula, Susanna, all by itself, what can we tell from this cost of delay information?
Sure. When we're just measuring the cost of delay, we see that there's a clear advantage for booking sync. Down here, it scored much better. But as you mentioned, at this point, we haven't acknowledged effort, which is half of the WSJF equation. There's an argument to be made at this point with just cost of delay that you would lose more value over time by not doing booking sync. But without understanding the effort, you don't have the whole story yet for prioritization.
Outstanding. Very, very well said. So now what do we do with this cost of delay figure? You're going to want to remember those numbers because we're going to get to our actual formula. We're going to take that cost of delay and divide it by effort. And Dave, I might be not surprising people, but how do we plug in that denominator in this formula?
That comes right back to the cone scale. And again, I'm a big fan of planning poker. I talk about it in my book. Um, and that planning poker really helps because especially when you get into effort, and by the way, when you're estimating effort, you want to involve the people who are actually able to do the work. And I say able to do the work, it doesn't need to be the people who are actually going to do the work. A lot of times we don't know which development team is going to take this on, but you can't sit in a room without anybody that represents the development side and estimate effort, because then it's just a wish. So you need to have some sort of representatives. We pull architects and developers in when we're doing early estimation for a new project, and we haven't even formed the team yet. The team hasn't been provisioned yet because we're still in the estimating phase and our client isn't ready for that next step quite yet. But what we don't do is have a bunch of people do this estimation who couldn't, at least theoretically, go ahead and build the product. So that's a super important point and a trap to avoid.
Outstanding. So now, as we move forward here, we're going to take those cost of delay figures for each of these two figures. We're going to divide them by the effort, and we can see that we actually have a pretty clear difference. Susanna, whenever we talk in Agile, we always talk about user stories, but as the hypothetical product owner for Latch, I feel like there's a pretty compelling story here as well.
Absolutely. Ultimately, this is about two features that out of the four we started with, we have a strong, have very strong user appeal. Both of them will eventually bring great value to the business. But when we estimate the time required to execute and deliver on that feature, it becomes clear what the winner is. Custom notifications is the best to do first. This is simply because we're getting our value earlier.
That is very, very well said. It's a pretty comprehensive framework. Dave, as our hypothetical product owner, I do have one concern, and that is I'm thinking about lots of times these really, really big, amazing features. Lots of times, big, amazing features take a lot of effort. And so if that perceived effort is really, really high, I'm concerned it's going to be difficult to get booking sync up to the top of my backlog. And so the fear then is that our biggest challenges that can move the needle the most, they might never get tackled. So how do we guard against that?
Yep. And one of the words you use there is a little bit of a trap for product owners. You said perceived effort. This is estimated effort. This is what the developers believe it will actually take as compared to other features, right? There's no time involvement here. This is a 13 versus a 5 versus a 20 versus an 8. But it really is about what they believe it's going to take for effort, not knowing all of the details about everything. Another big powerful part about this particular technique and using that cone scale for estimation is we can do estimation with very little information. And that's what we need to do. We can't go off and spend 2 weeks on each individual feature trying to figure out everything that's going to be involved in doing it. We need to make these decisions in about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if it's a really contentious feature and a contentious estimating process. But what you're alluding to is, putting my product owner hat on is, well, guys, booking sync is almost twice as big as custom notifications. And the typical product owner might say, is it really a 13, guys? Can't you squish that down? And the scrum master protecting the team says, hold on, guys, let's not beat up the estimators. But a lot of times what you can ask is, instead of asking, is it really a 13? You can ask, what makes that a 13? And you might have, because we're doing a very lightweight process, you might have, say, 5 or 10 bullet points that talks about, well, what does booking sync actually mean? What are the acceptance criteria for booking sync? And you might ask the team, like, looking at this list of 10 bullets, what's the big deal here? What's the 13? They may say bullet number 7. That's where most of the effort is. And then you as product owner might read bullet number 7 and say, well, shoot, if I don't have that, I don't think, in my conversations with the customers, I don't think they're really going to care that much if they maybe have to wait for that piece. Guys, what if I took that bullet number 7 out? And they might say, oh, well, then it's a 5. Perfect, right? If you change that 13 to a 5, now the booking sync is a clear winner. Now I can deliver that value, and I can save that cost of delay by being a little bit more creative. I've essentially split this feature now into the 9 bullets that I'm going to get pretty fast here. I'm going to take that 1 bullet out, and I'm going to make that a different feature. And we're going to do that. We're going to kind of treat it differently, or maybe treat it as a different user story if we're kind of getting into the nuts and bolts here of getting this into a team. So although product owners can't say, you need to change that estimate, they can ask those questions, which is all in the interest of getting as much business value as fast as possible.
Very well said. Now, Dave, you mentioned user stories. For those teams that are really used to Agile, we know we talk about user stories, but we also talk about epics. And so we're talking about how to apply these formulas. And we haven't spent any time today about saying, well, are we applying this to an epic or a story? Susanna, can you talk about what you've seen as far as best practices go about where we should be applying these types of formulas?
Sure. As we talked about, the what if you could only have one thing approach works really well in this scenario of a product owner organizing the work for one or a couple of teams. And this level of prioritization is typically done at the story level. So I think that approach fits well there. And that's where you would see story level prioritization. The analytical models, as we've discussed, really fill a different need, but it's worthwhile to note they take additional work, additional time. So the juice probably isn't worth the squeeze at the story level where a PO can apply their good judgment. Where it is worth it is probably when an organization is trying to prioritize their initiatives, specifically when you need to balance the needs from the various areas of the business. These models provide a way to solicit and make sense of those inputs. There are a few words used to describe that size of work. Some Agile practitioners use the term epic. Some use the term feature. I don't think the term matters so much as sort of noting it's best to use these analytical models probably to plan. I'll use a much more technical term, chunks of work that you would actually go to market with. So when you're trying to prioritize your initiatives is a better time to use a more analytical model. And that makes sense to get more inputs in for the rest of the organization.
Outstanding. That's great advice. Wow, so much information today. Great insight from our panel. Now, along the way, we've tried to help you think about these frameworks and how they might work for you. Dave, how would you summarize Kano? Where does it fit in? What's it good for?
I really like Kano for user or customer sentiment. Getting an idea of what they are going to think about this, particularly when we're kind of, locked within our 4 walls and kind of dreaming up these features. Well, what are our customers going to think? I'm also a big believer in getting things into your users' hands as fast as possible, because there's only so much you can do. I've spent years of my life running focus groups only to release those features that they swore up and down that they would love. And they said, this is okay. I'd rather have this other thing. So I'd rather have those years of my life back. However, we did use Kano analysis to get an idea of where those different features would fall in terms of the performance, basic, exciters, et cetera. So I like Kano for the features where you really want to get customer sentiment. Now, some of them you don't need to ask about, right? You don't need to ask about the login page. You know that, well, we're going to have a user login. So I can just exclude that from my survey. But you might have a set of features where you look at them and say, we don't really know. We think these are pretty good, but let's see if we can get some folks to comment on it. And as Susanna said, you can start generating some good results in as few as even like 10 or 15 people. The other thing you can do, getting into sort of the user experience side of things and customer research, is you can do that Kano survey verbally rather. you can call someone up and say, all right, I'm going to ask you about a few features. And maybe you're only going to ask them about, 5 or 10. So you're not on the phone with them for 2 hours. But oftentimes when you ask those questions, they'll give you more. They'll just keep talking, and you can record those sessions and really get some good intel. And you might only need to do 5 to 10 of those interviews to really get, if you pick your targets well, sort of a diverse prospective user base, you can get some really good feedback.
Suzanne, I know you have a lot of experience with WizGIF, and quite frankly, it looks like there's a lot that's baked into that to like.
I think so. We're running out of time, so I'll keep this short. What WizGIF acknowledges that businesses have to take into account not just their customer-driven goals, but other sources of value as well. And again, most importantly, what it's going to take to actually execute on those.
Very, very well said. This brings us up to the Q&A slide. So keep those questions coming in. We do have several. The first one was actually something that I neglected to mention in our introduction. Are there other frameworks that are out there? And the answer is, in preparation for today's webinar, we've actually been writing a series about different feature prioritization frameworks. If you thought these were good, you should see the ones that didn't make it into today's program. They're not quite as good, but they're very good. So feel free to check out our blog where you'll learn about the RICE feature prioritization framework and many, many more. But we've got some really, really cool questions here. So I'm going to go right into the questions. Estimating the effort. How deep do you go? Do you go to architectural design, resource capacity, and skill set accounted for? How long should you spend on an estimating this effort?
I can start with this one and hand it over to Susanna if I miss anything. What I really, really like about the combination of planning poker and story points and the cone scale, which we've kind of talked about in a slightly different context here, is it's very fast. Now, what we do is we do a combination of working with a team, again, a team of people that could do the work. Doesn't mean that it needs to be the exact team. Have them understand the user stories. And when we say user story, we mean something of any size. It could be what we've been referring to as a feature here, or an epic, which is a really large user story. It could be something smaller, but something that describes the intended outcome from the user's perspective. And we spend typically, and you may be shocked by this, 5 minutes to maybe 10 minutes on each one of those stories, or in the context of this conversation, features. So we're not doing an architectural design, we're not doing resource capacity, none of that. And that's the beauty of using relative estimation, because remember, we're picking something as a 3, a 5, an 8, a 13. That has nothing to do with resource capacity, skill set, expertise, or anything like that. That comes along later. That comes along when we're going to actually allocate resources to the project. Now we can estimate who we think is going to work on that project, where we can start thinking about how many of those points they can actually get done in a 2-week production cycle. And then we can start applying time to it. By the way, I stepped through this entire process in my book over the course of, I think, about 3 chapters. So a little bit out of scope for what we can explain here, but the short answer to that is we spend 5 to 10 minutes. We can estimate in about, call it 3 or 4 2-hour meetings, we can estimate 6 to 12 months worth of work for one team.
I'll just jump in and add on. Oftentimes, it's really easy to start going down the rabbit hole of all the many, many things to consider when estimating the effort. When you're conducting one of these, a tool you can use is pause the conversation when you hit that 5-minute mark and just try to vote. See how closely aligned everybody is at that point. And if you're all aligned, then you can move on. If you're really still very far off, then you might want to spend another 5 minutes on it. I've actually been a part of some of these sessions where we set that initial vote at the 3-minute mark. So it's key to just have somebody running the session, I think, that is keeping an eye on that timer and kind of helping move those conversations along, and not letting us get too deep into the rabbit holes, because obviously there's so much to consider.
It's a great Great feedback, Susanna. Thank you. I actually want to ask the next question to you first as well. This question is asking, when there are both internal and external users and both have importance, how do you account for that in your cost of delay model? And I'm also thinking aloud here, you've got internal and external users, but Susanna, you sometimes deal with multiple internal teams that are competing for resources. So again, I think that the big basis of the question is, how do you make sure that you are normalizing your inputs across the various formulas?
Absolutely. And while you might not have external users in these estimating sessions, I think this goes back to what Dave was hitting on with, you need to have the right people in the room. So it's not just the people who are capable of doing the work, but it's the people who are selling it. So oftentimes sales is that voice of the customer in these conversations, or the account managers. It's also important to have folks in the room who have to support this once it gets into the market. Have folks in the room who, deploy it to the customers and do the work to make it real, if you will. So I think it's just making sure you have those voices in there, even if it's not an actual external user, having somebody in the room that can represent that voice.
That's very well said. Dave, here's one that I'm thinking about as well. I get the feeling, I love the formulas and we're plugging in data. However, we're capturing that data in a moment in time. And so, what are your thoughts in terms of, how often should we be calculating these formulas? If we calculated something 3 months ago and that feature didn't make it to the top of the backlog, it's possible those numbers have changed. So what are your thoughts in terms of tracking or rescoring these formulas over time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think that there's a little bit of gut feel involved there. And then I think there's also probably a factor of timing. So typically in an agile approach, you have larger stories that start coming up to the top, and those larger stories might be so large that they're really more of a feature or epic sort of thing. I would say when you're getting to the point, if those stories have been sitting in there for a while, say 3 or 4 months, and they're getting to the point where they're slowly nudging its way up to the top of the backlog, to the point where you need to split them into smaller digestible chunks, so to speak, that might be a good time to ratify it. Also, it's not like you have the conversations with these stakeholders and then you don't talk to them for 3 months, right? There's a sort of a constant conversation of what's going on. So for example, getting into that example feature of where we promised it to a customer, that deadline might move because, hey, you know what? We talked to the customer, they actually want something different. And we actually promised them something different. We need to go through that process again. When you get into a larger organization, I'll pivot over here to Susanna. When you get into a larger organization, there are very fixed timeframes when you do that for a certain span of time. For example, when you're using something like SAFe.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add there because I think you actually captured it, Dave, pretty well.
Wonderful. I love this question. We've talked a lot today about, okay, so you've given me great formulas to figure out what gets to the top of the backlog, but what about the bottom of the backlog? And I'm just going to read this one. We've actually done a great job of pivoting from massive app to an MVP. Wonder where I learned that from. But as we close in on shipping in the next month or so, any advice for the jumble or pile of features and stories, quote, laying on the floor? Great question.
I'll take this one, Dave.
Go ahead, Susanna.
You tell me if you are in alignment. I think that you want to continuously prioritize. So I don't think there is a valid scenario where you've done everything that matters and then the rest, you don't have an indication of what will come next. You just continually do this exercise to keep that backlog in priority order. And then if you have features that are, quote, on the floor, you might not need them. So maybe you go to market without them and then, conduct this exercise with your customers again. Again, it's reprioritization based on the current market climate, the current market conditions, and how your users are interacting.
Yeah, to expand on that. So there's certainly, so first of all, the product backlog is always in a force ranked order. So you don't go through 1 through 35 and then everything else is number 36. It's always in a force ranked order. But as things are more pushed off toward the bottom, we do end up with these buckets. We might have the bucket, which is the, well, someday maybe. And then we might have the bucket, which is the nice to have. So, but within those buckets, we haven't really force ranked them. So I think to Susanna's point, I would keep at least the next sprint or two's worth of stories force ranked to the best of your ability. But I totally agree with Susanna. There's one word that dictates your next step: ship. And then the next word is listen. So it's going to become pretty obvious. My experience has been that you don't really want to spend a whole heck of a lot of time pulling your hair out trying to figure out all of the priorities that are going to govern the next 3 months after shipping. Because as soon as you get it into users' hands, you're going to start getting that feedback and they're going to start yelling about things that you might not have even thought about or that are lower down on the list. So it's actually going to become pretty self-evident once you expose that new product to the real world.
For our final question today, another just great question, Dave. I'm going to come right back to you with this one because I know you've written in your book that you know Agile in many ways is a social engineering framework to enable human beings to collaborate and to build alignment with one another. But can you talk a little bit just about, you know, how do we do that? How do we provide psychological safety for collaboration of many stakeholders, whether that's a junior developer or somebody who's been doing it 30 years, or the CEOs in the room as a stakeholder? You know, how do you in Agile make sure that everybody is getting their voice heard in these conversations?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different facets to that. And I think we should get to Jim's question as well there. I think a couple of facets. One is that, as you can see, we're talking about an analytical process, right? We're trying to make the math speak as opposed to getting into some of those biases, whether it's the authority or the loudest person in the room or the most recent piece of feedback. When you get down into the nuts and bolts, I think there's two factors. One is following the rules, and then the other one is having a good person who's actually going to orchestrate that process. You know, in the Scrum world, it's typically the Scrum Master that's facilitating that. And larger frameworks such as SAFe have equivalent folks that are the owners of the process. And the other piece here is that the planning poker process I really enjoy. For those who are uninitiated, planning poker, again, is a sort of a secret voting system where everyone's going to put down their vote. If you had a deck of physical cards, you would I'm going to take the 3 card out. I'm going to put it face down in front of me on the table. Someone else might take their 5 card out of the deck, place it face down in front of them on the table. And then when everybody has voted by putting their cards down on the table, the facilitator says, all right, turn them over. And everyone turns over their card. And we look around. And then what we do is we say, the lowest person is going to explain their perspective. The highest voting person is going to explain their perspective. And then we re-vote. And only when we reach agreement, or at least get close. So for example, we've got a whole slew of votes, but then we get to the point where everybody's a 5, but there's 1 3. We might look at that person, the facilitator says, Jane, are you okay coming up to a 5? And she might say, oh yeah, yep, I'm fine. Or it might be all 8s and there's 1 13. You know, John, are you okay coming down to an 8, or do you want to fight for a 13 and keep having a discussion? But what that removes is certainly removes the authority bias, because everyone has voted. And again, it's up to the facilitator to make sure that the person that's been there for 30 years isn't bullying everybody. And everyone's votes individually count the same, meaning everyone has a voice. In fact, if that loudest person in the room is in the middle of the pack, they don't even typically say anything. It's the low person and the high person. So that social engineering helps a lot. But again, you have to have that strong facilitator. If you do have the person that's going to kind of bully others into getting their way, that facilitator is going to work pretty hard to kind of stick to the process. And you know, what we've seen is that as teams get used to this process, they get a little bit more confident when they actually understand that this is in fact safe, meaning they are going to have their votes considered with the same weight as the person next to them. I might be 2 weeks into the company, but I have expertise in this area, and I'm sitting next to the person who's been there for 30 years, and we each have equal weight.
That's very well said. One more question then, as it relates to, again, making sure that we're doing this consistently. Should the prioritization group have a canonical reference so that the stories they align on are both consistent and repeatable as we look at those estimates? Jim's commenting that he's envisioning almost a quarterly strategy meeting where new initiatives might get compared to last quarter's data.
So I can speak to how I've seen this done in practice. I'll let Dave talk about it in theory. In practice, I haven't seen much reference to a prior quarter. What I have seen is looking at the list of features to be evaluated holistically and having the group vote on what's the smallest piece of work that we're evaluating and what's the largest. And that kind of sets the tone and the parameters for the estimation. I also have seen if you have to break up the meeting in a couple of sessions, referencing back, this very similar feature in the previous session got scored this, we're way off. Again, it comes to that strong facilitation there. I haven't seen it from quarter to quarter, but I like the idea.
Yeah, and this is one of the challenges to relative estimation. Well, relative to what, right? Because it is all about comparing. All right, this feature compared to this other feature, is it bigger, smaller? How much bigger? How much smaller? And that's how we do the estimating, because we as humans are actually really good at estimating relative size. We're pretty terrible at estimating absolute size. So there's really two questions. One is, how do you get the starting point of the relative to what? And that's really what Susanna said. The other way that we've done that is using anchor stories. The team picks out something that feels like a 2 and feels like a 5, or maybe feels like a 3 and feels like an 8. And then we estimate everything else relative to those stories or those features. The other thing we can do is solving another problem, which is we want some alignment across teams, right? We don't want one team's 20 to be another team's 3. Because now if we want to compare what's going on with those teams, for example, looking at velocity, how much can a team actually get done in a quarter or a sprint adding up to a quarter? So we don't want them wildly off. It might be that they're slightly off between teams. One team's 5, might be another team's 8. But the other challenge with that is that if we have one team living in the 20 to 40 realm and 13s, there's not much to move around there. And if we have another team that's just living in the 0.5 to 1 to 2 range, there's not much wiggle room in there either. So what we do at Ascendle is we actually have reference stories. We actually have for example, this is the kind of story that might be a 3 or a 5 or an 8. And we then have teams cross-reference that. The other technique we use is we cross-pollinate estimators. So estimators usually get kind of a good feeling of what looks like a 3 versus an 8 versus 13 or 5 or whatever. And we actually have them participate in the estimating for different teams. We inject those experienced estimators to kind of help with that initial estimating process to seed those reference or anchor stories at the right level of the scale. And we see it works pretty well. Again, because that scale is biased toward sort of living in that usually kind of 2 to 8 to 13 range for most stories, and then the 20 becomes big. 40 and 100 kind of says, this is really huge, and we actually don't quite understand it when it gets up to 100. So hopefully that helps.
I'll just add there too that in practice, when going through WSJF, I've seen the sizing capped at 20, which helps make sure you're sizing chunks of work that are executable within a constrained time period, and that you're not getting into a scenario where you're trying to estimate work and you don't know enough about it to give a proper estimation. Because if you're seeing something like 100, it probably means we don't know enough and it's a really scary feature. So if in the case of one of these relative estimating sessions, and we've capped it off and there's a push that this is way bigger than all the other 20s, that's a sign that you might need to split the feature up or go back and research and define it a little bit better so that it can be properly estimated.
Great advice from both Susanna and Dave. Hey, it appears we've actually answered all those questions. We really appreciate all the feedback from everyone today. Thank you all again for attending today's webinar and participating with such great questions. 2 reminders, you will be getting an email with a copy of all the slides. Second reminder is please feel free to check out our website. We've been writing about all kinds of feature prioritization frameworks over the past several weeks. Dave and Susanna, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with all of us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And great job, Marcus, Susanna. Thank all of you for taking the time out of your schedule. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the questions. Bob, thanks for these comments that you've put in. Maybe what we can do is, I don't remember if we haven't answered these questions, if they're going to get into the recording, but maybe we can carry some of these tips into our post when we post these slides and recording. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.